Morning team, and welcome to this, the 59th Learn with Lorna. I'll do my usual and just wait a few seconds before getting started. I always like to see the first few numbers of people coming in, that I can see people are watching and I know it's going out and there's no immediate crisis unfolding. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service covers the whole of the Highland area, which is an area about the third of the size of the Scottish mainland. And we have 4 archive centres. So we have an archive centre in Inverness, the Highland Archive Centre. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree. Hello to everybody saying hello. Where have we got? Crieff, Stornoway, East May, lots of places. And yes, it is a wee bit warmer this week, Penny, I agree. Before I go any further, a reminder, as always, that this series is brought to you by Highlife Highland at no cost to the viewer. That Highlife Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series of talks. But if you are in a position to be able to donate towards our work, then we're truly grateful for that, and as I always say, thank you to those of you who have. It really does mean a lot to us. This week we're continuing our theme of business and industry, and this week we're looking at the aluminium industry across the Highlands. There's a lot to say, so I'm going to launch in very quickly. I've got quite a lot of things to read to you as well, so I will try not to go over, but we'll see. So the aluminium industry has been an extensive employer in the Highlands over the past 130-ish years. A huge industry which has quite literally shaped the landscape of the Highlands. We hold in our Lochaber Archive Centre and in the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness a really wide range of material relating to this industry and documents relating to the four smelters that existed across the Highlands. We have booklets and letters and photographs, and we even have an ingot of aluminium from the Foyers smelter, which I love. It was part of a school project that Foyers Primary School undertook that came to us within our school Highland Council collections, so we have an aluminium ingot. Unusual for us to have an object, but it went along with the collection of records. So I'll touch on these things as I go through. The other thing I wanted to say right at the beginning is that there were factories elsewhere. So the British Aluminium Company, who I'll go on to talk a lot about, did have factories and bauxite works and things in Northern Ireland and right across the United Kingdom. But I'm only going to be talking about the Highland ones. I found it really interesting when I was researching this that we use aluminium every day, day in, day out. It's a metal we're so familiar with. But it was really strange to think that it's quite a young metal compared to the likes of lead or iron or bronze or the things that have a very long history. And so the story of the development of aluminium is really very recent. And so I wanted to start by reading out an extract from a booklet that we hold at the Highland Archive Centre called The History of the British Aluminium Company 1884 to 1955. And that will give us an introduction to the subject of aluminium. And so it reads like this. Aluminium occurs abundantly in the Earth's surface, but it is not found as a metal. The task of separating it from its ores requires techniques and methods which have only been within man's power for little more than a century. For that reason, aluminium is a relative newcomer in the world of industrial metal. Although it was known about for some time that the metal existed, the task of producing it defied all efforts until about 1827. Then, for the next quarter of a century, it remained a laboratory curiosity, and even until early 1890 it could only be regarded as a semi-precious metal used for making jewellery, statuettes and costly trifles. By the late 1880s, however, 2 new processes were discovered, one for extracting alumina from the ore, developed by Bayer, and the other for converting alumina by electrolysis into the familiar bright metal aluminium discovered by Hall and Heroult. Fundamentally, these 2 processes are still the standard processes of today, and as a result of their discovery and development, aluminium ceased to be a luxury class metal and became a metal with a great commercial future. A single comparison illustrates the dynamic change that took place. In 1889, the world price of aluminium was equivalent to £3,000 a tonne. By 1896, so only 5 years later, it was £163 a tonne. So a very clear understanding that as they started to understand how to extract and how to create aluminium, that it ceased to be a precious metal and the market value dropped. So the British Aluminium Company was formed on the 7th of May 1894. So as I say, really interesting how recent it was. In that same year, it acquired the exclusive British and colonial rights for both of those processes. So first of all, the extraction process perfected by Carl Joseph Bayer from Austria. That was extracting the alumina from the ore, which is bauxite. And then secondly, the reduction process for converting that alumina into aluminium via electrolysis, which was discovered by Hall and Héroult. The electrolysis process required a huge amount of electricity. So in order to make that economically viable, of course this is all new processes and you don't want to be taking huge economic risks, so in order to make it viable, they needed to be able to generate large amounts of electricity at a low cost. And the aim was to do that via water power. And then of course the Highlands was looked to as an obvious place of a huge source of constant water. So not long after this, the estates just to the south of Inverness, the estates of Gorthlech, Wester Upper Calder and Lower Foyers came up for sale. And so the British Aluminium Company, which I say had only just been formed, purchased those estates with a view to building the UK's first ever large-scale hydroelectric power scheme and an aluminium reduction factory on the banks of at Foyers on the banks of Loch Ness, which I'm sure any of you who are local will be familiar with the area I'm talking about. Now, straight away when this purchase took place and when British Aluminium Company took over, there were protests about opposition to the schemes. And I wanted to read two of these to you. So if you remember, possibly a few weeks ago when we were talking about tourism and I spoke about Robert Burns and the fact that Burns had written a poem about the Falls of Foyers and this extraordinary natural beauty and scenic spot. So it was a really popular site, the Falls of Foyers, a scenic spot, a tourist attraction, a local attraction. And so it's extraordinary. There are letters within our County Clerk series of all sorts of people writing to protest about the possibility of heavy industry happening around the area of the Falls of Foyers. And the letters come from people as diverse as, I'll just read this list to you because I wrote some of them down because I thought they were extraordinary. The president of the Alpine Club, the secretary of the Climbing Club, that all makes sense. The president of the Birmingham Central Literary Society wrote in protest. The Friends of Wilmslow Cycling Club in Cheshire. 337 members of the civil service working for the General Post Office in London wrote to object. And so I wanted to read to you a couple of these objections that had come in about the construction of the smelter. So the first one is memorial regarding the Falls of Foyers, sent to the Right Honourable Lord Balfour of Burleigh, Her Majesty's Secretary for Scotland. Your petitioners have learned with very great regret that the works that are being proceeded with at Foyers, Loch Ness, which are intended to destroy the waterfall known as the Falls of Foyers by diverting the water from it for the purpose of working machinery. And they're wanting to point out that these falls are of historic interest, endeared to the Scottish people by their beauty and association, that they are not equalled by anything of their kind in Britain, and it would be a national loss if the Falls of Foyers should cease to exist. So objections coming in there about the fact that heavy industry will disrupt scenery and beauty spots. The letter written by the 337 members of the GPO reads like this. To the Inverness County Council, we, the undersigned officers of the Postal Order Branch General Post Office, beg to record our protest against the proposed destruction of the Falls of Foyers by the British Aluminium Company. Not only will the falls be deprived of their water supply, but the river will be polluted and the adjacent vegetation ruined by the poisonous waste products of this manufacture. We therefore venture to express a hope that the Council will make full use of its powers to prevent this act of desecration, and will refuse to grant any further concessions to the company, which could also injuriously affect the natural beauties of the district. So interesting that those protests at that time were about the scenery, about the beauty, about the impact on tourism, about the ecological and environmental impact. So all sorts of themes coming out of there. In the end, the protests were unsuccessful and the permission was granted, but it was granted on the understanding and on the promise that the falls themselves would not be interfered with, and that the Falls of Foyers would not be allowed to run dry and would not be diverted. And so the construction went ahead, and the factory was in production by June 1896, which is quite extraordinary when you think about the company only being formed 2 years earlier. And it was the first factory to produce aluminium in the UK. By 1904, the output at Foyers was about 1,000 tonnes of aluminium per year, which was 10% of the total world demand. The raw alumina and then the refined aluminium were transported up and down Loch Ness and via the Caledonian Canal. And again, it's something you'll have heard me talking about a huge amount. It's that link between the collections that we hold, because as you'll know, we hold the Caledonian Canal records, a link between those collections, but also just a link between all the subjects we've covered in the last year and a bit are all happening concurrently. They're all having knock-on effects on each other. So the fact that the canal was constructed was something that enabled this to take place so much later. There was a narrow gauge railway created as well, and that linked the factory at Foyers down to the wharf on Loch Ness. It's interesting that many of the things that we now associate with aluminium, I don't know if I'm speaking for all of us here, but when I think of aluminium, you think of the fact that it's a light metal, it's light, it's durable, things like that. But all of those facts that we know now weren't known at the time, and the fact of the potential of creating aluminium alloys wasn't known at the time. And so the company initially focused on that reduction process and then on creating semi-fabricated products, so things like sheets, tubes, wires, things like that. And the community of Foyers grew up around about the factory, so there were houses constructed, and that 1956 booklet that I had read from mentions the fact that all the houses in Upper and Lower Foyers and the village of Glenlea were built by the company. They constructed a school, there was a shinty team, a football team, etc. And by 1935, just incidentally, the British Aluminium Company owned over 170 properties in Foyers itself. But by 1904, Foyers could no longer meet the growing demand. So that was one thing. The fact was that demand was growing. They were kind of victim of their own success in the industry. But also the fact that, if you remember, they had acquired those exclusive rights, British and colonial rights, to use those processes. Well, the hay rope patent was about to run out, and so they knew that when that expired, they would be hit with a lot of competition. And so when they had purchased the land to build the Foyers smelter, the British Aluminium Company had also bought water rights over a much wider area, right down to Kinlochleven in Lochaber. And so the next thing they did was to set up the Lochleven Water and Electric Power Company, which later merged with British Aluminium. So they had set up several subsidiary companies to do different things. And they were set up to create a factory in Kinlochleven, which would have 7 times the production capacity of Foyers. And I think this is amazing. Let me read to you what the project created, the Kinlochleven project. They constructed the Blackwater Dam, which was the largest cubic content of any UK dam for years and years and years afterwards. They created a reinforced 4-mile concrete conduit, a pipe track of 6 lines, which were 1.25 miles long, which led to a powerhouse. They created an aluminium reduction works with a carbon electrode factory, a township for employees, a deep water harbour to handle the incoming supplies. But before any of that could be done, they had to dredge the loch and they had to build a pier to in order to be able to bring in the supplies at all to start the construction work to create these factories. And so I wanted to read to you an extract about that. Let me just find... Okay, so they talk about the construction of the Kinlochleven setup, and this is how it reads. The building of the dam and powerhouse and works at Kinlochleven in the early years of this century caused a stir in the Western Highlands, something like that caused by a gold rush in the United States or Australia. A whole district was opened up. A new community came into existence. And a new source of national wealth and local employment was suddenly developed in a district which had been virtually unchanged for centuries and where it had been felt that nothing could possibly happen. Incidentally, the community at Kinlochleven just escaped receiving the name Aluminiumville, which was seriously proposed by people at the time. And it's interesting, that talk of that new community bursting into existence, because as I mentioned, that was exactly what had happened at Foyers, and an extract talking about Foyers talks about the again that need to create the infrastructure to even build the factory, and then the fact that people came from all over to work, and that construction of as I mentioned, the school, the community hall, the houses, that if any of you are watching from different parts of the industrial areas of England, you'll be familiar with that as well, of that entire township and settlement growing up around an industry. Now, the building of the Kinlochleven smelter took 5 years, between 1904 to 1909 roughly. All in all, there were around 2,000 to 3,000 workmen or navvies who constructed all of those things I listed. And they lived 5 miles up the hill in huts. As you might imagine, their work was long and hard and backbreaking and tiring, long hours, hard work. And the booklet that talks about the history of the aluminium company says men were continually drifting in, working for a few weeks and then drifting out again. Many came from the Outer Isles, speaking only Gaelic, and all foremen were expected to speak both languages. So just again, as we've talked about with different subjects, the likes of the asylum records, that need to have a bilingual element as well. I wanted to read an extract from the Oban Times from 1970 that talks about that construction. And it's from the 13th of April 1907, and it says, Kinlochleven. It is estimated that now over 1,000 men are working at the various contracts of the Lochleven Water Power Works. It is understood that when the nights begin to get shorter, work will be carried on both day and night. A large model lodging house is in the course of construction at Kinlochleven. A temperance hotel has been built, going back to last week, and the new shops are also well forward. Several houses of the model villages have already been occupied. A new bakery built and fitted with the most approved modern improvements by Messrs. Bar & Co. has proved a great success. All the works are well forward considering the bad weather experienced during the prolonged winter. When the night shifts commence, arrears of work will be greatly overtaken, and although the director's wish of being able to manufacture aluminium by autumn may not be realised at that time, the present good weather and the arrangements that are being made to hurry on the works will go far to have the works completed in the time expected. So you can see that there was a date they were trying to get to. Now, the construction took a very long time, and in the end they had to construct a temporary factory, and that was initially used to meet that target date. But the main production works started in February 1909 and were in production from then. From 1911 onwards, the output of that factory was 7,000 tonnes of aluminium per year, and add that to the 1,000 tonnes that was happening at Foyers. This is a really interesting case study in seeing just how an industry moves and grows and develops, and you start thinking you're achieving a vast amount with 1,000 tonnes, which of course they were at the time, but just how they need to grow and expand in line with demand and knowledge at the time. It's very interesting. We have a great collection in Lochaber Archive Centre relating to the Kinlochleven smelter, particularly a great collection of images which were deposited with us by the Lochaber Archaeological Society. So if you have a look back on the Lochaber Archive Centre Facebook page, you'll see a few of them were up this week. And also if you have a look on our website, Ambala, which I have mentioned a lot, is www.ambale.org. And there's a huge amount of photos on there as well of the construction of the factory, of the temporary factory, the management site visits, things like that, the football teams, those kind of social activities on there as well. So that was from 1911. So that takes us in to the First World War period. Now, the impact of the First World War, of course, was that many men went off to serve. And one of the documents we have, which is particularly touching, and if any of you are on Twitter, please have a look at our Twitter page, because I posted it this morning, which is the Roll of Honour of the British Aluminium Company, which lists all of those from the company who went to serve in the Great War. And it's a really substantial list, and a large proportion of them come from the Lochaber smelter. As well as that impact, of course, many of the men remained because there was a huge increase in demand for aluminium. There was an increase in demand for aircraft parts, so for instance, fuselage, items for ammunition, so things like shell fuse caps, and parts of Lewis guns, cooling fins for Lewis guns were made of aluminium, and other military equipment, so things like mess tins, water bottles, things like that, all needed cars for the military, all needed to be ramped up in production. And there was the creation of the first all-metal aeroplane in 1920. And of course, as all that was happening, they had a huge increase in knowledge and understanding as they were forced to that, that limit of production capacity. That was all happening at the same time, in an increase in knowledge and understanding of the metal and the potential of the metal, and what would happen if you alloyed it with other metals and things like that. And so the result was that world output of aluminium doubled. The factories, of course, as we'll see in the Second World War as well, the factories were guarded by the police and the army constantly for the duration of the war as well. But all of that, of course, meant expansion. So I'm going to pause there to remind you that this series is brought to you by Highlife Highland at no cost to the viewer, and that Highlife Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these. So we'll come on to the second part of that then, which is we kind of leave them at a need for huge expansion. And the huge expansion came in the form of the Lochaber hydroelectric scheme and reduction works. Again, when this scheme was mooted, there were protests, but this time the protest, one of the protests, was at the concept of taking water from Inverness-shire for the benefit of Argyllshire, which I just think is a very human thing to say. And so there were some changes made to the plans before that the Lochaber smelter started to be created. But it resulted in the creation of a new power station and aluminium reduction works at Fort William. Construction for this started in 1924, and again there was a temporary power station built, but this time the temporary power station was built to power the equipment so that they could construct the remaining works. There was a 15-mile tunnel put in from Lochaber to Fort William, and that was constructed through Ben Nevis to join the new power station and the reduction works. And if any of you are familiar with Fort William, I don't know if anyone is watching in Fort William today, but you'll know that the look of that as you look across to Ben Nevis and you can see those works there. Production at the Lochaber smelter started in December 1929. The scheme there was split into 3 stages. So the first stage, which took place in the early 1930s, had a desired output of 10,000 tonnes a year. So you see what I mean about that gradual increase of capability and understanding and production. And so they had an output of 10,000 tonnes a year in that first stage. It was such a substantial and kind of prominent and important industrial work. King George VI came to visit the works in 1930. And then in the late 1930s we came on to stage 2. Now, stage 2 was constructing dams, so there were dams built to raise the level of Lochaber and Lochlagan, and a 3-mile tunnel built between them to control the levels. Lochlagan's length was increased by 4.5 miles because of this water raising project. The main railway line had to be diverted and raised, and the power station and reduction works were expanded to add another 10,000 tonnes a year to output. The third stage of the Lochaber works was the diverting of the floodwaters from the River Spey into Lochlagan, and that was carried out during World War II, and it was actually finished in 1943 with the help of Canadian troops who were in the area. And so as a result of all of those three stages of the Lochaber works, by the time the Lochaber scheme was completed, they had a generating capacity of 120,000 horsepower, which made British Aluminium Company's production capacity in the Highlands over 30,000 tonnes a year. And of course, as I've mentioned with all of these, with that came houses, post offices, shops, halls, schools, playgrounds. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the construction, as I mentioned, Foyers, Kinlochleven, Inverlochy, entire settlements built up around this industry. We come then into World War II. As I mentioned, that third stage was completed in World War II for Lochaber. The other thing that came in with World War II was aluminium control. So those people who worked for British Aluminium Company effectively became government servants on the declaration of war. Ahead of the declaration of war, there had been an amassing of strategic reserves of aluminium, because there was an awareness learnt from the First World War of and the growing knowledge of what aluminium could do, that they needed to amass reserves of aluminium, particularly with a view to constructing aircraft. And then something I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, the instruction to increase output whilst conserving supplies. So all other development projects were halted at that point. And this is something we see across numerous record types, which in the First World War and the Second World War, which is that stopping of everything other than everybody contributing to the war effort. And so we see that in the aluminium industry as well. Now, by 1941, the aluminium control had become the light metals control, and that had representative members from the British Aluminium Company, but also from representatives of magnesium and silicon and other light metals to work towards how those metals could be used to support the war effort. In the end, the demand for the light metals was far greater than anyone anticipated, and during the war, the world production of virgin aluminium rose from 690,000 tonnes in 1939, so 690,000 tonnes, to 1,920,000 tonnes in 1943, so within a 4-year period, more than doubled. Of course, during the Second World War, the factories and the dams became targets for the Luftwaffe's bombs because, of course, they were contributing substantially to the war effort. And so in Lochaber Archive Centre, we hold German Air Force aerial photographs showing the Kinlochleven and the Fort William smelters as targets. Some distraction was achieved by creating a decoy factory in Lochaber. So the decoy factory had smoke machines and an underground generating station to make it look like it was operating. And so some distraction was achieved by that. But the Lochaber smelter was targeted several times throughout the war. In 1940, the smelter was hit, several bombs fell, but they failed to detonate. And it's quite interesting, one was on the pipeline and one was on the powerhouse, so you can only imagine the level of destruction if they had exploded. And then in 1941, the smelter was bombed, and I wanted to read to you an extract from a German wartime magazine, Der Adler, which is the Eagle, and it describes the Luftwaffe bombing raid on the aluminium factory. And what's interesting is, as we will be familiar across all sides of war and conflict throughout history, is just the terminology and the way it's worded. So it reads, Flight Commander Fedora, commander of one of the Ju-88s, together with three of the men of his crew, had to deal with a task that demands the highest flying abilities and martial spirits. The preparations were made with extraordinary diligence. The operation was planned well in every detail. Only thus could the attack be successful. In the sunset, just a few metres above the ground, the Ju-88 speeds through the shortage between the Sound of Arisaig and Lochiel. The tops of the wings swipe dangerously near the mountain sides, but on the ground hell breaks loose. The workers bolt out of the factory halls into the open air, half stunned and half dazed. The Ju-88 flies so low that the artillery is not able to fire due to the speed of the attack. Then the bombs come down on the great factory, into the turbine room, between the long factory roofs. Spouts of smoke and fire rise upwards. Explosion follows an explosion. It is done. Again, English war industry is badly damaged. And again, as I say, it's that very emotive terminology that all sides use during conflict. The smelter was bombed again in 1943, but in Foyers, it was 1941 that was the big date, 13th of February 1941. The factory was successfully targeted then, and it caused devastation. It caused devastation to buildings and to the operations, but that was very quickly turned around and resumed. They very, very quickly went back into production. But what was absolutely irreparable damage was the loss of two men who worked in the Foyers smelter, Murdo MacLeod and Archibald MacDonald. And that loss, you can only imagine, to a small community, something we see in the news, as any of you who live in Britain will be familiar with this week. The unexpected loss of life can have a huge impact on a small community. And we have that recorded in our collections, in cuttings, in police daily occurrence books, and different things. After the war, the industrial landscape changed again. Aluminium was by now becoming very common, and although British Aluminium Company were the UK leader still, it was becoming harder to find bauxite resources. That's, if you remember, was where the alumina could be extracted from. Harder to find bauxite resources. And so the company acquired interests in Canada, in Guyana, in Australia, but they weren't very successful, and there were financial problems in the company. And so the function of the Foyers smelter then changed to focus on the production of pure aluminium, but economic pressure led to its eventual closure in 1967. But the site was taken over by the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board, and by 1975 they had installed a 300 megawatt pump storage system there. Interesting that with that kind of decline and changing nature of the industry, in the late 1960s, the decision was taken to build a new smelter at Invergordon. And that was based again on the potential for low-cost electricity, which, if you remember, was what started the whole thing in Foyers, looking for a source of low-cost electricity. And this time they believed that low-cost electricity would be generated via nuclear power. And again, there were protests about the establishment of the site for heavy industry. Jane Patterson, who would go on to become Jane Durham, campaigned to save Ord Farm, which was the site that was proposed for the construction of the factory. It had been her childhood family home, and she campaigned against it being used as a smelter site. And later in the year, I've got it programmed in, I'll come back and talk about We Hold Jane Durham's papers and into her life of conservation and campaigning, and I'm going to do a talk on her. It was unsuccessful, and the site was turned over to the British Aluminium Company. And I wanted to read an extract from the third statistical account that talks about how that happened. Now, you'll have heard me talk a lot about the first and second statistical accounts. The third were written in the 1950s and 60s, but this one for the parish of Roskeen has a postscript that was added in the 1980s. So, postscript by Reverend Andrew Howe. Development and explanation of the parish of Roskeen came to fruition in the late 1960s and early 1970s, although not in the way envisaged. In 1968, the Secretary of State for Scotland gave permission for the British Aluminium Company to establish an aluminium reduction works at Invergordon, capable of producing 100,000 tonnes of aluminium per annum. And in 1969, the construction firm of Taylor Woodrow established a work camp at Inverbrechy, employing at its peak some 2,000 personnel, a considerable proportion of which was incoming labour. The smelter was in production by 1971, employing at first 460 and subsequently 950 people. And of course, even though we're 100 years later nearly, those same conversations were had around housing, infrastructure, facilities, that awareness of a huge incoming labour population. And so how do you integrate them, and how do you provide the facilities? And this time it was done differently. So you'll have seen from the previous smelters that the British Aluminium Company constructed from scratch a village, or they built a hall, a community centre, a school. But this time they tried instead to integrate people coming in with the existing communities. And so the Secretary of State set up the Invergordon Steering Group, and that had representatives on it from the government, and from Ross and Cromarty County Council, from British Aluminium, from Invergordon Town Council. And they decided that they would they would site the housing and development at Alness, just along the road from Invergordon. And so it was recorded like this. The Alness Community Association, successors of the Ratepayers Association, along with the statutory bodies, found itself fulfilling the functions of a social development committee, concerned with the problems of families settling into a new environment, involving detailed plans for the education, welfare, social, community and transport needs of a rapidly expanding populace. Working closely with BA management at all stages, the association established as far as possible in advance the types and numbers of families who were likely to move into the area, and when including the statutory and voluntary organisations which would be paramount to the successful resettlement. As there was a relatively even flow into Alness, representatives of the various church, medical, social and educational bodies met informally every 3 months with the new residents so that a community gap was from the outset avoided. So a really interesting change in the way that they managed that. British Aluminium Company, Alness Community Association and the Ross and Cromarty County Council jointly built, among other things, the Avron Community Centre, which opened in 1972 excuse me, to provide social and recreational and educational opportunities for that community, and is a nice coming full circle. That is now a High Life Highland facility which serves the same purpose of social recreational opportunities. And all of this led to a huge expansion in infrastructure and a huge expansion in population. So the population of Invergordon and Alness went from 3,350 in 1967 to 11,225 by 1976. So within, again, that sort of 7-8 year period, almost 3 times the population. But that one wasn't to last, and you'll maybe see Anne McCulloch's comment coming in there saying that a sad time for the employees when the Invergordon smelter closed so suddenly. And it's interesting, Anne, that you've used the word suddenly, because the last extract I want to read to you is from the third statistical account. And it says, an announcement in December 1981 that British Aluminium was to cease production immediately was met with incredulity. The one major industry upon which so many minor ones such as transport, light engineering firms, commercial undertakings largely depended for their existence or for profitability folded, whereas the other, Highland fabricators, which had been regarded as a temporary industry, remained. This had a profound and immediate effect on the parish of Roskeen. Fears were expressed that Alness would become virtually overnight a ghost town. Remarkably, these fears were not realised. Though some members of the British Aluminium staff moved south to other employment and others were made redundant, though their situation was cushioned to some extent by redundancy payments, which now a year later are exhausted, a surprising number found alternative employment in existing industries or in the creation of new ones, albeit of a temporary nature. House building in the private sector has continued in Alness, and the community at the end of 1982 at the time of writing has arrived at some sort of equilibrium. So yes, I'm seeing your comments coming in of people remembering the moment that happened. A very sudden and huge impact on a community. The Kinlochleven smelter closed in 2000, leaving the Lochaber smelter in Fort William as the only remaining aluminium smelter in the country. It is still in operation. It's currently under the ownership of Alvance British Aluminium. The company changed names, as you'll have seen Alcan coming up. It was Liberty British Aluminium as well. So changed name and changed structure a few times in the last few years, last few decades. But now the Lochaber smelter under the ownership of Alvance British Aluminium. But I hope, I'm going to stop talking, I'm aware I'm nearly 10 minutes over, but I hope that you have seen through this just the scale of the aluminium industry, how many thousands of people in the Highlands were employed by it. A very, very important role in the story of the Highlands. The development of places such as Foyers, Inverlochy, Kinlochleven, Invergordon, Fort William, Alness, a really important part of our history. If you're interested in learning a bit more about this, do have a look at our online catalogues, and they can be found on our website. You can see there what we hold. And also the University of Glasgow Archive Service holds the official business archive of the British Aluminium Company, so do have a look there as well if you're interested. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I'm going to be looking at Skye's diatomite industry, so I hope you can join me then. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've found that interesting, and I will speak to you next week. A reminder before I go that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, if you have a look back on our Facebook or YouTube page where this film is, you'll see in the body of the text of the film a link to donate there. So thank you so much if you're able to do that. If you haven't yet filled in the survey about this series, please do. I'm going to close it in 2 weeks, so if you haven't done it yet, please do. I'll speak to you next week. Thank you.